Okay, we are on 23b, Chaf Gimel Amud Beis, and we're coming to the home stretch of chapter, Chapter 3, we're concluding now, right?
Chapter 2, I think.
We're finishing chapter 2 or chapter 3? I think chapter 3, right? Perek Shlishi?
No, chapter.
3.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. You're right. Yeah, chapter 3.
Yeah, it becomes the one nebulous kind of flow as we go through it. So we're coming to the stretch of chapter 3. And the concluding statement of the Mishnah was a number of laws with respect to the distinction between men and women in ritual law. And this stemmed from the discussion we had yesterday, which is the difference between a male kohen and his wife with regard to the mincha offering, the meal offering, which is the offering the Sotah offers. And there's a distinction there, that a male kohen, his meal offerings are a burnt offering where the entirety is offered on the altar, whereas that would not be the case for his wife. And thus in the case of the Sotah, where she is offering it, he also has a portion in it. We had this whole discussion on how we can balance between the two obligations. So from there, the Mishnah went on to list a number of other statements with regard to the specific difference between men and women in ritual law. So the Gemara is going to go through them, quote, citing to the Mishnah and the law that the Mishnah states. And then for each one, the Gemara is going to give us the scriptural source for the law that the Mishnah states. So it's going to move pretty quickly, unlike, yesterday's Gemara where we had to, think and break our heads to go back and forth in our minds as to what's going on. Here it's going to be very much straightforward, point by point by point. This law because of this verse, this law because of this verse, this law because of this verse, and so on. So this is the structure that we're going to be going with till the end of the chapter, essentially. So we start with this law here. It's on the, It's the third line from the top of the page. The law is as follows. Bas Yisrael HaMesunah V'chulu. A woman who's married to a kohen, so her offering is not to be eaten by the kohen, right? As we discussed yesterday at length, ordinarily, someone who offers a meal offering, a fistful is offered on the altar, and the remainder of that meal offering, the remainder of the flour is eaten by the kohen. But if the certain woman is married to a kohen, then the remainder is not to be eaten by the kohen, as we discussed at length yesterday, because her husband, the kohen, owns some portion of that offering. And the Torah explicitly states that his offering is not to be eaten by the kohen, but rather to be burnt completely. So the Gemara asks, my taima, what's the reason? Meaning, what's the scriptural source? And as Rashi explains, the specific question here is, what's the scriptural source to distinguish between a male kohen and a female kohen? A female kohen, a kohenet, who offered a meal offering, her offering is not burnt entirely on the altar. It's treated like an ordinary meal offering, in which a fistful is offered on the altar, the rest is eaten by the kohen. It's only if a male kohen brings a meal offering, or if a male kohen's wife brings a meal offering, and then he owns a portion of it, that's when the special law of the kohen is applied, and the meal offering is burnt in entirety. So what's the scriptural source to distinguish between a male kohen and a female kohen? Answers the Gemara, the Omar Krah, for the verse states, L'chol minchas kohen, and any offering of a kohen, kolil tiyeh, it should be completely consumed, lo toichel, it should not be eaten. End quote from the verse. Thus the Gemara says, the verse states kohen in the masculine, the loy kohenes, but not a kohenet in the feminine. Thus telling us that this law, which states this exception to the rule, that the kohen's offering is to be completely burnt on the altar, the kohen's meal offering to be completely burnt on the altar and not eaten, The verse specifically speaks of the male kohen, the kohen, and not kohenet, the feminine. And thus a kohenet, a female kohen who offers an offering, it's treated like everybody else's meal offering, in which a fistful offered on the altar, and the rest is eaten by the kohen. The next law.
Can I interject on that? Doesn't that negate the whole discussion yesterday? Why didn't they bring that argument in yesterday's conversation? Because that would have if there's a specific verse to that, then why did we have to go through this whole pilpul?
Good question. Yeah. So the pilpul yesterday is because she's offering the offering, and the law for her is that a portion, only a fistful is offered. But because the kohen, owns part of it, then for him, the entire thing has to be offered. What today's law teaches you is that yesterday's pilpul applies to whether or not he's married to an Israelite or whether he's married to kohenet. Either way, the same pilpul has to be used. Because even if she's a female kohen, her offering is still treated as a regular offering. Following? Not really.
I kind of lost it. Sorry. Maybe I have to. I didn't see the distinction when you raised the law today. It seems.
Today's law just tells us that the exception, right? Ordinarily, a meal offering is only a fistful going on the altar. The rest is eaten by the kohen. That's the rule. But there's an exception. And the exception is when a kohen is doing the offering. When a kohen is doing the offering, then the entirety is burnt on the altar.
Okay, yeah.
The law tells us that this exception only applies to a male kohen and not to a female kohen. So a female kohen, a kohenet, her offering is only a fistful on the altar, but the rest is eaten by the kohen. That's all today. Following?
Yeah.
So then, therefore, if a female kohen is married to a male kohen, right? Her parents are kohanim, her father's a kohen, so she's a kohenet, and her husband is a kohen. And she's a sotah. So she offers a meal offering. So the same conflict we discussed yesterday applies to them, even though they both happen to be born kohanim. Because he's a male kohen, and the exception applies to him in that his offering has to be completely burnt.
Oh, so he has an offering.
To her, because for her, only a fistful is to be offered. Because the exception to the rule in the verse, as we're learning now, is specifically to a male kohen. Clear?
Okay, I think so.
Sorry?
It seems like he has an offering then in the Sotah case.
Because he owns part of his wife's offering.
Right.
Every husband owns some portion of his wife's offering.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Clear? Good.
Clearer.
Okay. If something becomes a little more foggy, let me know. I'll try to clarify.
All right. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe this is the issue. Today's law is not about who he's married to or who she's married to. It's just a question of this exception that meal offerings are to be burnt completely on the altar. Does it apply to male kohen, whether he's single or married, or does it apply also to a female kohenet, whether she's single or married? It's just a question of where does this exception apply? And today we're learning the exception only applies to a male kohen. That's all. So a female kohen would also have to bring a regular Israelite meal offering. Right?
Okay.
Irrespective of whether she's married or not married. Now, yesterday's pilpul would be if she was married to a male kohen. So the exception applies to him, but doesn't apply to her. And now that she's bringing an offering and he owns a part of it, whose obligation do we do? His, because he owns a portion of it, or hers, because she's bringing the offering.
Okay, so in today's case, there's no simultaneous obligations happening.
That's right. Today's case is irrespective of that. It's just a question of, in general, this exception to a meal offering for a kohen being completely burnt, does it apply to males or females also? Answer, applies to males only. That's it. Clear?
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
I think that's where the confusion was. Okay. Meaning, I think the confusion was with connecting today's case to yesterday's case, when in reality, it's independent statement. Just about the exception in general and who it applies to. irrespective of their status.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, so the next statement in the Mishnah was Kohenet mischaleles, but Kohen ein mischalel, which means that a female Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, by her marrying someone she's not supposed to, she loses her status as a Kohen. But a male Kohen who marries a woman he's not supposed to doesn't lose his status as a Kohen. The Gemara asks, Minolam, from where do we derive this distinction? Or, as Rashi phrases it, from where do we derive that when a male Kohen marries someone he's not supposed to, he still retains his status as a Kohen? She says the Gemara, the Omar Kraf, because the verse states, V'lo yechalal zarei ba'amav. The verse says, don't marry such and such, speaking to the Kohen. You should not marry, let's say, a divorcee, because if you do, you will cause a void to your progeny, to your offspring. That's the word yechalal, means to cause a void. Meaning to say, says the verse, that if you marry this woman that I'm telling you not to, then your children will be void of this, they'll be stripped of the status of Kohen. And as Rashi points out, the Gemara elsewhere tells us that this statement, which says, do not marry such and such a woman, for if you do, you shall void your progeny, void them or strip them of their status. The Gemara elsewhere says that it's in the plural, implying that this union causes two people or two sets of people to be stripped of their status of Kohen. Namely, the wife who he marries, the woman he marries, she loses her status of Kohen if she was born a Kohen, and his children, because it's from a union that he wasn't supposed to be engaged in. But, says our Gemara, Zaroi mischalal, the verse states that his progeny, his children, are stripped of their status of Kohen. But Vahu, he himself, Eine mischalal, doesn't lose his status as a Kohen. This is the scriptural source for this notion that the Kohen still retains his status as a Kohen even after marrying a woman he's not supposed to. Now, as far as the law is concerned nowadays, to the best of my knowledge, he actually does lose his status as a Kohen, at least in certain regards, certainly.
How does the wife lose her status? If she was not permitted to begin with, she must not have been was she a Kohen? How could she lose?
Well, usually a woman who marries a Kohen herself gets certain privileges as a Kohen. But not in this case, because she married someone she wasn't supposed to.
So she already had lost her Kohen-ness.
Something like that, yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm pretty sure as far as the law is concerned today, a Kohen who chooses to marry someone he's not supposed to the best of my knowledge, he does lose his status as a Kohen, at least certainly in certain regards. But I'm going to put a pin in that and not say it with certainty because I'm going from memory. Okay. The next statement was, Kohen, the next law in the Gemara, the Mishnah, in distinguishing between men and women in ritual law is the following. Kohenet mitama, a female Kohen may become ritually impure, good morning, may become ritually impure by coming in contact with a dead body. So a female Kohen may attend a funeral, whereas a male Kohen may not, unless it's close family. Then he's actually instructed to attend the funeral and become impure. But ordinarily, a Kohen is not allowed to become impure. This law is relevant today because even though the issue of becoming impure is really only an issue for ritual in terms of going to the temple, The fact that I'm impure today, which I am because I've never been sprinkled by a red heifer, and I've never been sprinkled by the ashes of a red heifer, and I've been to funerals, doesn't stop me from functioning as a Jew. I just happen to be ritually impure. So the only thing that's being prevented from me currently is that I can't walk up to the Temple Mount, or I couldn't walk past a certain point in the Temple Mount because that's the location of the temple. So in theory, the same thing is true of a Kohen. Probably, I imagine most Kohens today are ritually impure. It's likely they've been to a hospital, and in a hospital someone dies there, then they become ritually impure, right? And Mashiach God comes very quickly. The Kohen will have to go through ritual purification, as the rest of us would. But nonetheless, there's still a prohibition against actually actively becoming impure, which means even if the Kohen right now, we know for certain that he is ritually impure, so he's anyway impure. So you might argue, well, I might as well go to funerals anyway. So the halacha is no. He may not actively or voluntarily become impure. I may voluntarily become impure. I can go to a cemetery whenever I'd like. But a Kohen may not voluntarily become impure, even if he happens to be impure today anyway, and even if it happens to not be a temple right now, so it makes no practical difference to his life. He's still allowed to function as a Jew. But nonetheless, he's prohibited from actively becoming impure. Whereas a female Kohen may become impure, just like I may become impure. I may go to a cemetery, so can a female Kohen. The Gemara asks, my time, what's the reason? What's the scriptural source for this distinction between men and women? That if male Kohen may not voluntarily become impure, whereas a female Kohenet may voluntarily decide to become impure. Says the Gemara, Amar Krok, as the verse states, when the Torah introduces this law of do not come in contact with a dead body, do not make yourself impure, with the exception of an immediate family in which the Kohen is obliged to go and become impure and attend the funeral. When the Torah introduces that law, the verse reads as follows. God speaks to Moses, and God says, Emor ala Kohanim, speak to the Kohanim, B'nei Aaron, sons of Aaron. The verse could have just said, speak to the Kohanim. But the verse adds, speak to the Kohanim, sons of Aaron. Thus teaching us, B'nei Aaron, the sons of Aaron are prohibited from the laws that are about to be stated in the Torah, which is, do not become impure, but V'loi b'nois Aaron, not the daughters of Aaron, because the daughters of Aaron may become impure. So the law I'm about to tell you, says God, speak to the sons of Aaron. They're the ones who need to know this law, that they may not become impure. The daughters of Aaron, if they'd like to, they can attend funerals and they can go to the cemetery, no problem. But they would have to go through purification if they wanted to eat truma or if they wanted to go to the temple, just as I would have to go through purification if I wanted to go to the temple. Okay. The next statement in the Mishnah was, Kohen oichel b'kache kache. Another distinction between men and women in ritual law is with the rule of eating what's called Holy of Holies. We mentioned this before a number of times, the axis of karbonos, right? You have on the one side the type of the substance of the carbon. Is it an animal? What kind of animal? Is it flour? Is it water? Is it wine? Is it oil? Those are your options. And then the other axis is what type of carbon is it? Is it a sin offering? Is it a peace offering? Is it a burnt offering? Is it a guilt offering? Right? These are the various different types. And then there's, the axis of you can be such animal with such kind of carbon, such flour with such kind of carbon, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So there's one class, the bottom axis, the type of carbon, sin offering, guilt offering, peace offering, and so on, are divided into two categories. One is called kache kachim, holy of holies, and one is called kachim kalim, minor holy. What's the difference? Yeah, the difference is who eats of the remainder of the carbon. You have the oila, you have the burnt offering, which is completely burnt on the altar. No human eats any portion of that animal, that offering. Then there are some offerings in which humans do eat some portion of it. But then within the category of offerings in which there's a portion eaten by humans, there's a division between different types. Some types of offerings is eaten by the kohen as well as by the owners of the ones who offer it, the owner, the Bailam. That's the Hebrew terminology. The halachic terminology is the owners, the one who offered the offering. So there's certain kinds of offering, a peace offering, a shlamim. If I offered it, like for example, a Yom Tif, certain types of offerings. So I offered it, so I would eat some portion of it. Some portion of it would be offered on the altar, and some portion would be eaten by the kohanim. Those karbanos in which I eat some of it are called kachim kalim, minor holy. The higher holiness, the kachim kachim, the holy of holies, these are the kinds of offerings in which a portion is put on the altar and burnt, and the rest is eaten by the kohen. The owner eats nothing. So this is a higher level of holiness. I mentioned this before. Holiness in halacha means restrictive, right? So the less one is allowed to do, the more restrictive it is, the more holy it is. A better translation for kadosh might be sacred, as in this is distinguished, this is separate, right? Like a Yom Tif is sacred. There's all kinds of things we don't do, all kinds of mundane activities. On Shabbos is even more sacred because there's less we're allowed to do, right? You're not allowed to cook on Shabbos. Yom Kippur is even more sanctified because there's even less we're allowed to do. You can't eat or drink, right? So as you become more separate from the mundane, the more exclusive it is, the more sacred it is. So here we have this higher level of sanctity, this higher level of exclusivity, in which even the owners who offer the offering don't get to eat any of it. Now, the Mishnah said that in such offerings, only the male kohen eats it, not the female kohen. When it comes to other offerings, the lower level of holiness, the portion that is to be eaten by the kohen, if he wants to, can distribute it to the members of his household, which he probably would do, because there's a prohibition against leaving the offerings over beyond a certain time. And sometimes it's a lot of meat to consume. So it's a lot of meat to consume. Some portion is offered on the altar and some is eaten by maybe the owner, right? But it's still a lot of meat to consume. So he might want to, distribute it amongst his family. And if he's going to do that, he has to make sure his family is ritually pure. But he could distribute it amongst his family, the house, members of his household, including his wife and children, right? So including females. Let me just conclude this. But when it comes to the higher level of holiness, in which the kohen eats a portion, only the male kohen may eat it. He cannot distribute it to the members of his household. He cannot distribute it to his wife and his daughters. Only the male kohen. Yeah. So just conclude, and I'll get to you. The ksiv, because the verse reads, "Called Zachar b'bnei Aaron Yarthel." All the male members of the children of Aaron shall eat of it. Rashi tells us this is referring to a meal offering, right? So only a meal offering, which is in that class of kache kashim, the higher holiness, in which the owners don't eat anything. It's only the kohen who eat it. Says the Torah explicitly, only the male kohen may eat it, not the female kohen. Whereas other kinds of offerings, the minor offerings, the minor holy offerings, in which the kohen also eats a portion, he may distribute his portion to the members of his households, including his wife and children. There's so much meat in the temple that, in fact, on the payroll of the temple was a doctor. And the doctor's job was to maintain the health of the kohanim as they're walking around barefoot on a cold floor and eating tons of meat. There's a doctor on payroll to handle all this. You know what were you going to say?
So my question was, when we say with the shlamim, it means that the entire animal is burnt.
No, that's oila.
Oila, okay, yeah.
Entire animal is burnt on the altar, yeah.
But it's obviously shechted first.
Yeah.
Right.
There's a whole process.
And then the skin.
So it's slaughtered and then it's prepared in a certain way and carried up in a certain way,
and now
it's a very specific ritual of how it's offered, not just taking the animal and throw it on the fire. No.
Right. The portion that the kohanim are eating.
That's the other kind of animal. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Is that that's like from the fire also, like only half burned, or it's
No. So a certain part of it goes up to the altar, and the remainder gets prepared by the kohanim and eaten.
Like cooked or raw?
No, cooked. Yeah.
Okay, right.
The different karbanos have to be prepared in different ways,
Right.
And sometimes there's other restrictions, like you can only eat it in the temple area, only eat it in Jerusalem, depending on the type of karban. Again, this axis tells you all these different details because there are so many variables. Okay. Which part of the animal is eaten, how much of it is eaten, how it's eaten, where it's eaten. Okay. So if you pay attention to the not just Rambam for sure, but if you pay attention to the part that we read just before Rabbi Shmuel, Ezehu Mekayman. Right. So you'll read it. That's Ezel Mokoim means where's the location, Shel Zvachim, of the offerings. Read it in English. It goes through carbon by carbon, who eats it, where it's eaten, where it's slaughtered, what location. That's what those Mishnahs are, at least. It's not all the details, but it's some of the details. So you can have a look at that. And there you'll see its reference. Kachim Kalim, the minor holy, Kachim, the higher holy, in the Ezel Mokoim, in those Mishnahs, it's listed there. So tomorrow morning, read it in English, and you'll see a lot of what we're talking about here.
Technically, there also must be, it's the kohanim that bring it up the ramp onto the altar.
Yeah.
And it's them that shecht it also.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a whole system of how they divide the job amongst the kohanim.
Yeah, but then let's say, technically speaking, like a cow, they bring up a cow. A cow is a huge thing.
No, they cut it. It's there's a whole process. We open tractate Talmud.
Okay.
It's a very short tractate. It has no disputes. It's just like a description of what happened on the daily morning ritual of the routine of the temple. And you can see all the details there, how they cut the animal up, and who carries what, and how much is carried, and how it's carried, all of that. They don't just carry a huge animal like that. It's not how. So I actually do recommend reading it. Read Tractate Talmud. Search it on Safaria in English.
Yeah.
It can take you an hour to read through the whole thing in English.
It's a tractate of Gemara.
It's a tractate of Mishnah called Talmud. Well, there is a tractate of Gemara also, which you could probably read also in the span of 2 hours. Whole tractate. Short tractate, a couple of chapters, and there's no disputes. It's this description. So it's not like you have to hold your mind and think this opinion, that opinion. You just no. It's Talmud Babli, and it's very straightforward. It's one of the easiest tractates to learn. Literally, it could take you an hour and a half to read it in English. And I recommend if you're curious as to how the temple operated, that's a good place to go. Masechta Talmud. Check it out on Safaria and take an hour and a half, read the whole thing. Okay. We'll do one more. So the next law that the Mishnah stated as a distinction between men and women in regard to ritual law is with respect to the tzaras. So let's look up the verses here. It'll be easier. So it's Leviticus 13, 44 and 45. So here we have Leviticus open already. Let's go to chapter 13 and 44 and 45. So the verse reads as follows. Ish saruahu, but this is talking about a person, tzaras, right? The law of the tzaras is the skin discoloration, and as a result of spiritual affliction, right? It's a spiritual kind of thing, not a physical ailment. And the kohen has to observe the skin discoloration, and depending on what happens, after a certain amount of time, he is declared as indeed a tzaras. He's declared as a mitzvah. Tzaras is the affliction, mitzvah is the person who carries that affliction. So he's declared as a mitzvah. And there's all kinds of laws. He's got to be outside of the city and the whole thing. So let's read the laws relevant to our discussion. So the verse reads, he is a man afflicted with tzaras. After the kohen has observed it in the various different details, it expanded, there's hair, there's colors, all kinds of details, but he's now declared as indeed a mitzvah. So he's a man afflicted with tzaras. He is unclean, meaning ritually unclean. He's tameh, he's impure, not physically unclean. He could have taken a shower that morning, doesn't mean anything. Ritually unclean. So the kohen shall shortly pronounce him unclean. So there's an instruction here. The kohen has to declare it. Right? This is an important law that the kohen has to make the declaration. So even if the kohen is not well versed in the laws of determining whether someone is a mitzvah or not, and he requires, let's say, the local rabbi to do the analysis, but the final declaration, which states, "You sir are a mitzvah, you sir are tameh," that must be done by the kohen. The kohen has to make that declaration. Right? So his lesion is on his head. Okay, there's different types of tzaras, so that's on the head, the rest of the body. Okay, here we're talking about it's on his head. And the verse reads, and the person with tzaras, in whom there is the lesion, his garments shall be torn, his head shall be unshorn, meaning don't cut his hair. He shall cover himself down to his mustache, right? He pulls over his curtain, and call out, tameh, tameh, declare he is impure. Okay. Specifically, we're going to be discussing the laws of a garments shall be torn, and 2, his head shall be unshorn. These are the 2 laws specifically we're looking at here.
It's a bit of an embarrassing thing.
Yeah, yeah. It's part of the whole point. It's a certain humiliation to send a message to everybody else that here's a person who didn't repent from whatever it is that is between him and God is afflicting him with this thing because of his lashon hara or whatever the reasons are. Okay, so now let's get to the Gemara. The Mishnah stated that a difference between man and woman is that a man, his hair is left uncut and his clothing is torn, but a woman is not. A woman is allowed to keep the dignity of her straight clothing not being torn, and she can cut her hair as she sees fit. That's what the Mishnah told us. So the Gemara asks, the Gemara says, Tan Rabban, our sages taught in explaining the source, the scriptural source for this law, the scriptural source to distinguish between man and woman, that when a man is declared as a Mitzvah, his hair is let to grow and his clothing is torn. Whereas if a woman is declared a Mitzvah, her hair remains as is and her clothing remains as is. And she's allowed to cut her hair and her clothing is not torn. So says the verse, says the Gemara like this. The Mishnah text reads, Ish. The verse says, as we saw in Leviticus, right in chapter 13, verse 4, he is a man afflicted. Ish sarua, implying it's male. So it says the Gemara, Ish. The verse states that a man, becomes a mitzara. So Ein Ela Ish, I might say the law is restricted to a male, that only a male can be declared a mitzara, because the verse says, Ish, a man, Isha minayin. From where do I derive that a woman can also be declared a mitzara? So Kishu Aimer, when the verse goes on in the next verse, in verse 45 to read, Vatsarua Asher Boy, that this mitzora who contains within him the lesion, Hare Kanshnayim, the verse declares there are 2 types of mitzora. And it's repeated. Let's go back to the verses. The verse reads, he is a man afflicted with saras, implying only a man. He is unclean. That's verse 44. Then verse 45 opens up, and the person with saras, in whom there's a lesion, his garment shall be torn, and so on. Why repeat it and say, and the person with saras? Just go straight to the point. His garment shall be torn. You already declared him in the previous verse, he is a man afflicted with saras. Just continue reading. His garment shall be torn. Why repeat yourself and say, and the person with saras? Because there is a person who has saras who is not the man we mentioned in the previous verse. Who is that? A woman. So the repetitiveness of the verse. In verse 45, it says, he is a man, a male of afflicted with saras. But instead of going straight to the law that his clothing shall be torn and his hair should grow, the verse interjects and says, and the person who has saras, implying there's somebody else. And thus the Gemara says, Hare Kanshnayim. Thus the Gemara says, we have 2. So thus telling us man and woman. Gemara asks if both man and women can become saras. Okay, if so, ish. Why say man in the first verse? Just to begin with, say person, and we'll know both male and female. Why start off by saying male and then adding another to tell you that also a woman? Just to begin with, say a person. Right? So therefore, it says the Gemara, it must mean that there's a distinction between man and woman. When it says man and then adds woman later, it's to tell you that you treat men and women differently. Namely, ish paireya, the male lets his hair grow and the male gets his torn clothing, but the woman not. And that's why the verse has to split them in 2. One statement about men and one statement about women, to teach you that they are treated differently. Even though they both can become saras, they're treated differently. The woman is afforded the dignity of not having her clothing torn and her hair growing long. Had the verse just said a person, without separating between men and women, you would say that all the laws apply equally to men and women. And a woman also has to tear clothing, and a woman also has to let her hair grow. And therefore the verse distinguishes and says man and also woman. Not saying a person and incorporating them both as one. To teach you that you treat them differently. And the male can handle, so to speak. You can shame him a little bit. Tear his clothing, let his hair grow. But a woman is afforded the dignity of not having her clothing torn and not letting her hair and allowing her hair to be cut and kempt appropriately.
And I guess you couldn't have said woman in the second part because then it would imply that it would be only for women.
That's right. Had it said women in the second part, then it would be implied that only women get the undignity and that the man gets away without it. And thus it doesn't say explicitly women, it says person the second time to teach you that women are treated differently, but actually in the sense that they don't get the application of the verse. Yes, good point, Robert. Okay, so we're going to stop over here. And God willing, on Monday, we will, tomorrow I'm not going to be here. I'm going to New York for Shabbos, my brother's Ufruf. So I'll be on the road tomorrow morning.
Oh,
God willing, on Monday, we will pick up and conclude the chapter, going through again a number of distinctions the Mishnah told us between man and woman in ritual law and the various different verses that support these distinctions. So that concludes on Monday. A wonderful day.
thank you. Good Shabbos.
Rabbi, Oliver, Yeshikoach, and Derech Hatzlacha for tomorrow. Drive carefully.
Yeah.
Our health, we're gonna have you all.
Amen. Good health. Good, safe trip.
Thank you, thank you.
Focus at the hate, come to Rick is at the hate with God's help.
Amen. Thank you.
Amen.
Take care. All the very best. You should go from strength to strength and get Shabbos there. God bless you.
Let's be well.
Amen. Good Shabbos.
All the
Take
very
care,
best.
Joe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. God bless.